There used to be millions of salmon in the upper Columbia River, and they used to go all the way up to the headwaters at Columbia Lake, so right up to the town of Canal Flats now. And that's 2,000 kilometers from the mouth of the Columbia River at Astoria all the way up to Columbia Lake. So Chinook salmon in particular used to make that journey, and the ones that made it all the way to Columbia Lake were typically what are called June hogs. They were June hogs because they were very large, 40 pound, 50 pound, 60 pound, 70 pound Chinook salmon that were caught off the west coast of Vancouver Island and off the coast of Washington and in the lower Columbia River. But they were the ones that had the energy to swim all the way up to Columbia Lake. David Thompson, when he was first exploring in the upper Columbia and was stationed at Invermere when he built his fort there, they got salmon in late August, early September that helped sustain them that first winter. And so yeah, that's the long-term history. And of course, Indigenous nations throughout the Columbia used to harvest and benefit from and use those the salmon that were swimming all the way up the Columbia River. We know that the Canadian Indigenous nations, so Sinixt, Ktunaxa, Okanagan, and Secwepemc, harvested in the realm of 15,000 to 75,000 Chinook salmon per year on their way up here. But equally, in terms of the actual number of fish harvested, the U.S. tribes in the lower Columbia River harvested way more than the tribes up here. And I'm not saying that in any sense of unfairness. That's just the reality. The large numbers of fish from a whole bunch of different populations swimming up the lower Columbia and were, harvested by the lower Columbia tribes in vast numbers. And then there were sockeye, and so sockeye generally require a nursery lake. So the sockeye adults will come and spawn either at the head of a lake or in the lower reaches of tributaries around the lake. And then, of course, their eggs will incubate in the gravel. They'll become alevins. The alevins will eventually absorb all the yolk and swim up into the water. And for sockeye, they would fairly soon, when they're fry, they would fairly quickly swim down that tributary stream and into a lake, where they then spend a year or two eating plankton in the lake and growing to a size where then they can make the migration to the ocean. So that's what used to happen in arrow lakes, and to the tune of millions of sockeye used to be supported and used to return to Arrow Lakes, what's now the Arrow Reservoir. And so those were the two principal species in the upper Columbia. We also had steelhead in that part of the Columbia River, kind of just north of the Canada-US border and into the Pend d'Oreille River. I work for the Ktunaxa Nation Council, and our chairperson, Cathy, said to me once, "Bill, the loss of salmon was equal in cultural impact to the loss to their being forced to live on reservations and to the residential school experience." So the cultural loss caused by the loss of salmon had that equivalent and tremendous impact on the Indigenous nations' cultures and communities. So clearly the salmon abundance was in decline already by the early 1900s. And that was caused by a couple of things. There was a tremendous amount of harvesting. They had massive fish whales and seines in the lower Columbia River that were decimating the upriver salmon populations. And then there was habitat destruction, a lot from mining operations, even up to Revelstoke and into the Slocan River, etc. So that combination of habitat loss plus overharvest led to a rapidly shrinking set of salmon populations in the upper Columbia. But then what brought it all to a complete end and prevented any resurgence of the salmon was Grand Coulee Dam. The government of Canada said, "You don't need to consider putting fishways in Grand Coulee Dam." This is in a letter from the head of the Department of Fisheries at the time, because Canada has no interest in the fish that come into the upper Columbia. And so we have that correspondence written down. And so Canada had that position. And then the International Joint Commission then said, okay, well, if Canada's not really interested in the salmon upstream or salmon going upstream into Canada, then we don't need to take any precautions and we can let the US go ahead and build this high-head dam. So that happened in 41. So that was the completion of the Grand Coulee Dam was the end of the upstream salmon populations. The three nations, unfortunately at the time not including the Ktunaxa Nation, but Okanagan Sailks, Secwepemc and Ktunaxa got together in the early 90s, and there were three leading chiefs. So Chief Albert Saddleman from the Okanagan Nation, Chief Wilfred Jacob from the Ktunaxa Nation, and Chief Paul Sam from the Secwepemc Nation, Shuswap Band and Invermere got together and said, we need to work together to bring our salmon back. And they created at that time the Canadian Columbia River Intertribal Fisheries Commission. So that was in the early 90s. I was their first employee in 1994 and began to work on their long-term task of an obligation to restore the salmon. And then in 2006, we started to engage with federal and provincial governments in a technical level, saying, okay, let's get together, let's talk about what's possible, what are the impediments to restoring salmon, what are the potential benefits, what are the costs, so to delve into those kind of questions. And we made some progress on that front, but it's always been the case for the last 25 years where the Indigenous nations have been saying, Canada and BC, we need you to work with us to bring the salmon back. We can't do it ourselves. You've got the laws and the regulations and you have the financial capacity to work with us to make this happen. And we really didn't make much progress on that front until a couple of years ago. And what changed was we had, both at the federal and provincial level, we had governments that had committed to the UN to, first of all, endorse the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, endorsed the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and embraced the concept of reconciliation. And I really recall a meeting we had a year and a half ago, and representatives of all five governments, Okanagan Sailks, Ktunaxa, Secwepemc, Canada, and BC, were all in the meeting and were asked, why are you prepared to do this? And a senior Fisheries and Oceans official said, we're not doing this because of any laws or regulations or even policies. We are doing this because of reconciliation, because Indigenous nations have been saying for years that this has been a huge loss to Indigenous nations. And if we're going to rebuild our nations and our cultures, we need the salmon to do that. So both governments were coming to the table out of that spirit of reconciliation. And that led to ultimately to a letter of agreement between the five governments about how we're going to work together to restore the salmon. That was signed on July 29th of 2019. And you might think I'm crazy to get really excited about a piece of paper, but it's a piece of paper we've been working on for 25 years to get the federal and provincial government to say, yeah, we're going to work with you on this. So it is cause for excitement. We think it's a huge step forward. So there are lots of private dam operators in the US Pacific Northwest, and they've all been faced with this. And so they've all had to figure out how are we going to, and in a lot of cases, the Energy Regulatory Commission says, you need to provide a 97 or 98% survival rate for salmon passing through your dam and the reservoir upstream and downstream. And so they have this legal standard that they have to meet. And so they've got the best engineering and technical minds together to say, how do we achieve that? How do we achieve safe passage of salmon at our dams, both for tiny smolts going downstream as well as for big adults? And it's spawned things the whoosh technology or the salmon cannon, which is a pneumatic tube, and those pneumatic tubes can now shoot safely and more effectively than even swimming up fish ladders. They can transport adult salmon over a 300-foot dam. And then to go 600 feet, say, for example, to surmount Grand Coulee Dam or Revelstoke Dam, you just need to put two of them in a row. And, so you can go over the first 300 feet, and you may ultimately be able to even go higher than that with one salmon cannon. So that's one technology. There are very simple technologies too, like what's called trap and truck, which is we'll catch the fish downstream of the dam, we'll put them in a big tanker truck, we'll drive upstream, and we'll release them upstream. And so that's completely feasible and inexpensive. The only downside is when we start talking about millions of fish, it's probably not up to the task. But that's a starting point. And it's all driven by this technological innovation that's happened mostly on the US side. So the technological developments, principally on the US side, are making it increasingly feasible and probable that we can safely bring salmon back and to have abundant salmon that'll be available for people to harvest, both from Indigenous nations and from the non-native neighbors of the First Nations communities. People are concerned about the effects of water contamination and how it might affect their ability to bring salmon back. There's a lot of things to note here. I mean, in comparison to other regions, we think we have contamination problems here, but they are not comparable to what exists even in the lower Columbia River, but also in the Sacramento, where there are healthy Chinook salmon stocks. But when you think of some of the key sources of pollution that people talk about, so one's the radioactivity in the Hanford Reach resulting from the nuclear activities there. But the healthiest populations in the Columbia now spawn upstream of the Hanford Reach. So and the big issue is that radioactivity is probably a concern for fish that live there year-round in multiple years, but the salmon have such a brief exposure to it that it doesn't seem to have caused the harm that it might be for a long-term resident fish. And then people talk about the Teck smelter at Trail, and the contaminants from that used to be a very serious problem, and there are occasionally spills since, but long-term contamination with metal contaminated sediments is now gone and is being cleaned up, and we do have sturgeon populations that are surviving, and the hatchery produced sturgeon are doing well. Water temperature with climate change is certainly a concern for sockeye salmon, which are more intolerant of warm water temperatures than Chinook salmon are, both at the adult stage and at the egg stage. And so we're doing the analysis of, okay, if we have a 2 degrees C increase in global climate and average global temperatures, what's that going to mean for our river temperatures? And what does that mean for temperatures all along the migration corridor in the Columbia River? With that temperature increase, will it still be possible for Chinook salmon to survive? And so we're doing that analysis. One of the encouraging things is with water temperature, we can change the operation of dams and to release cooler water from the lower levels of the dam. So there are ways to potentially mitigate the effects of climate change. Yes, there are huge challenges, but they're also saying, look, 3 generations of Indigenous people have not had access to salmon and have not had meaningful amounts of salmon in their diet. And so it's time to change that for people to be able to enjoy, one of my favorite foods, absolutely my favorite food in the world, which is sockeye salmon. The best evidence we've been able to collect going back through pioneer stories, etc. Sturgeon used to go all the way up to Columbia to at least to the mouth of the Spillimachine River near Briscoe, near Spillimachine, and they used to actually chase ling burbot up to there and eat the ling after they'd spawned, and so there's very good evidence of that. Mica Dam put an end to that. And indeed, there are stories when Mica Dam, very clear stories, and indeed photos from when Mica Dam was built of sturgeon trapped in the works while they were doing the construction of Mica Dam. So very strong evidence that Mica Dam and subsequently Revelstoke Dam put an end to sturgeon migrating upstream. And so now we only have sturgeon left in the Canadian section of the Columbia. We have sturgeon in Arrow Lakes, but a very small number, 50 to 80. And we have sturgeon downstream at Keenly Side Dam, so between Castlegar Trail and into the US, probably in the order of 1,500 sturgeon there. And then sturgeon in the Kootenay River system in Kootenay Lake and going up to Bonners Ferry. But the losses of sturgeon were, definitely linked to the construction, not so much of Grand Coulee or Chief Joseph Dam, but to the construction of the Columbia River Treaty Dams, the Keenly Side Dam, Mica Dam, and then on the U.S. side, the Libby Dam. Fortunately, the sturgeon populations have been temporarily rescued through hatchery programs, but the hatcheries aren't a long-term solution. We have to find a way so that sturgeon can spawn in the wild and survive in the wild and support their populations and support harvest and support all the different species that rely on sturgeon long-term. So many species were highly dependent on salmon. So sturgeon in Arrow Lakes used to hang off the mouths of some of the major tributaries during salmon spawning season, and they didn't so much go after the fish moving upstream into the tributaries. After the fish had spawned and died and were moving downstream, that's when sturgeon relied on. So a huge part of sturgeon diet was from salmon, and of course that was lost in 1940. Began to touch on, all the things that used to depend on salmon. So sturgeon being one of them, but grizzly bears definitely being another species that was highly dependent on salmon. They would, and of course they have their annual cycle of berries and then higher into the alpine and then moving down, but they would typically come down to the riverside, the lower reaches of the tributaries to Arrow Lakes and Columbia River to fish for salmon. And just the same as the famous pictures we see from the coast in Alaska in particular, where big numbers of grizzly bears are down there catching salmon and teaching their young grizzly bears how to catch salmon. And there's an estimate that coastal grizzly bear populations that can still go and harvest salmon are more than twice as productive as our inland grizzly bears that no longer have access to salmon. And then there's things like ospreys and great blue herons, all the avian species that at one time in their life would rely a lot on the young fry and smolts of Chinook and sockeye salmon. So those are all losses, big losses to our ecology. And like perhaps the most profound loss from losing our salmon is the nutrient contribution that they used to make to our streams and lakes. So, one of the ways you can look at salmon and think of them functionally is there are these tiny things that leave the rivers and lakes because there's not enough food for them there and nutrients, swim all the way out to the ocean, swim way out in the North Pacific Ocean, gathering food and nutrients the whole time. So growing from that size to that size, and then they return to the Columbia River, swim all the way upstream and spawn, and then they release the nutrient. When they spawn and die, then they release their nutrients to the streams and to the lakes, but also to the riparian vegetation and the trees. So they've done experiments in Alaska, in northern BC, Haida Gwaii, other places where, what you can look at is what's called marine derived nitrogen. And so there's different isotopes of nitrogen, and nitrogen 15 is more prevalent in the marine environment than nitrogen 14. So if you measure that ratio of nitrogen 14 to nitrogen 15, you can tell whether a nitrate molecule, for example, actually originated in the ocean or originated in the land or in the streams close to the land. And what has become clear is where there are salmon, up to 50% of the nutrients that are in the trees, in the willows, in the alders, in the vegetation adjacent to the streams, and up to 50 meters away is marine-derived nitrogen, which means they're getting their nitrogen from fish dying there, grizzly bears dragging the carcasses out, otters dragging the carcasses out, eagles dragging the carcasses out and dropping them, is a huge contribution to the productivity of those riparian areas. So probably used to see a lot of that along the Revelstoke reach here. One could expect in the Revelstoke reservoir, of course, it used to be a very narrow river that the reservoir is a barrier to caribou moving across. And we not necessarily that we think that caribou moved frequently, but genetic interchange between populations is critically important to their long-term survival. So it only takes, every 10 years, a few caribou migrate across what would be the Columbia River rather than the Revelstoke Reservoir, and that's probably prevented from happening now by the reservoir. Within the Columbia River Treaty negotiations, we've been working the Canadian side in particular around restoring ecosystem function around our reservoirs and rivers that are affected by the Columbia River Treaty dams. And when you start to look at that question, you realize that our biggest ecosystem losses have been floodplain, riparian, and wetland ecosystems. And for me, the striking comparison is always between the Revelstoke Reach, which, of course, for several months of the year is completely inundated by Arrow Reservoir, and then it's exposed again. And then, of course, compounded by the fact that we go from very low river discharges to high river discharges almost every day, sometimes of the year. So there's a large area that's kind of neither fish nor fowl. It's not land or it's not water, and it never has time to fully function as a terrestrial or riparian ecosystem. So it's a question of how long are they inundated for? How frequently? It can't happen every year. So it has to be variable, which is an intrinsic property of nature, and it depends on the depth of inundation. And so, is there an opportunity, in some measure, to restore that? For example, in the reach right here in Revelstoke, is it possible to restore it in the Upper Duncan River? And is it possible to restore it upstream of Ktunaxa Reservoir? So those are the questions we're looking at. Is we lost so much floodplain, riparian, and wetland habitat, and it's those ecosystem types that so many bird species are dependent on. That shorebirds, ground nesters, and ospreys and eagles, and it goes on, that are dependent on. So for ospreys and eagles, they need those riparian trees to nest in and to watch for fish from, and to be able to fly and dive into the water, harvest fish, and bring it back to their chicks. So restoring those floodplain, riparian, and wetland ecosystems is, to my mind, a linchpin of restoring ecosystem function, so we can have a diverse array of vegetation as opposed to the monoculture we largely have out here now, and all the bird and animal species that go along with that. And I was once paddling down the Columbia River from here down to Shelter Bay, and the reservoir level was rising, and it was the most tragic thing to see. That we were paddling down the river, and while we're paddling down, thousands of voles were swimming across the river from east to west because they were being displaced out of their homes on the wetlands on the east side and being pushed over to the west side, and I expect largely not surviving, but it was a really striking thing for me.